Okay, welcome back, everybody. Hope you all enjoyed lunch downstairs and had an opportunity to socialize or chat up some of our speakers, maybe get a little work done. We're glad to be back here today at the Pew Conference Center. This is actually our second event here at Pew, and we'll be back again in January for the release of Quality Counts 2011, so mark your calendars, January 11th. And just want to say we appreciate all the hard work of the staff here at Pew. They do a great job, and they really make events like this run like clockwork. And I think we've heard a lot of compliments today about the beautiful space here, and that's why we keep coming back. I'd also be remiss if I didn't thank some of my colleagues at Editorial Projects in Education and CAP and AEI for all they've done to bring this event together. At one point last night, I started to make a list of everyone just at EPE who'd been involved in some way or another in planning and putting together this event. And it started really quickly to look like the masthead we run in the newspaper with our entire staff. So I'm not going to mention everybody by name. I would like to single out Megan Grass, who's at the back of the room there. You've probably seen her running around here. She's from our marketing department. She's also one of our event gurus and is our logistical lead for everything today. So she's been doing a great job making the trains run on time. So thanks, Megan. Also here from EPE are Paul Martin and Casey Sellers, who are helping out running mics and making sure people know where to go, and Paul Highland and Matthew Sabellis, who are helping out with the webcasting today. American Enterprise and the Center for American Progress have been great partners in this work. It's been terrific working together with them on this. And you'll see some of our friends from those groups here today. We've got Cindy Brown, Jasmine Jones, and Annabelle Hogg from CAP. We've got Rick Hess, of course, here throwing off the AV squad because he doesn't have a tie on today. And Whitney Downs and Jenna Schutte from AEI. So it's been a lot of fun bringing this event together, and we hope you enjoy it as well. So no DC-based event would be worth its salt if it didn't have a real insiders policy roundtable as part of it. So we certainly would not want to disappoint. This is inside the Beltway time for us here today. So up until now, we've had a great panel of policy experts and a tremendous amount of experience, both inside and outside the government right here on the stage. We have a senior official from the U.S. Department of Education, senior education advisors from Congress on both sides of the aisle, and one of the think tank's world's most well-known and prolific commentators. There's a comment downstairs that somebody's bookshelf was sagging under the weight of Rick's many, many volumes, and so Rick keeps himself busy. So we're going to dig into the national education agenda here right now as it's evolved over the past couple of years, and also in particular keeping an eye toward where it's likely to be headed in the future. I think we've all got that look back, look ahead frame of mind right about now. Moderating the discussion will be Allison Klein. Allison Klein is a staff writer for Education Week. She reports on federal policy and Congress, and she's also half of the dynamic duo that writes our Policy K-12 blog, and as everybody in this room probably knows, that's required reading for all things educational and political. So let me turn over the stage to Allison.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. I know you all didn't come here to hear me, so I'm going to keep this introduction short. And just introduce the folks that we have here today. We're lucky enough to be joined by David Cleary, who's Senator Lamar Alexander's Chief Education Advisor. Before going to work for Senator Alexander, Mr. Cleary served as an aide to then House Education Chairman John Boehner, who I'm sure you all know is our speaker in waiting, where he focused on disability policy. We also have Jamie Fastow, who's the Senior Education Policy Advisor for the House Education and Labor Committee. Jamie previously served as a vice president. Oh. I don't know what to
I coughed in it.
Oh.
My mic is live.
Okay, great. Jamie was previously the vice president of the Alliance for Excellence in Education, Excellent Education, where she worked on secondary school reform. She's also served as a legislative assistant for Senator Patty Murray, where she focused on education, children, and family issues. And luckily, she hasn't coughed yet, so good job, Jamie. Jamie, unfortunately, has to leave a bit early today. So we're also joined by Rick Hess, who is the resident scholar and director of education policy at the American Enterprise Institute, as Chris told you. Rick, I think, has written more books on education than I can count. And he also serves as the executive editor of the journal Education Next. More importantly, he writes a great blog at edweek.org which is also required reading, Rick Hess, Straight Up. And last but not least, we're joined by Carmel Martin, who's the Assistant Secretary for Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development at the U.S. Department of Education. Ms. Martin served as the Chief Education Advisor for Senator Edward Kennedy. She worked on issues important to children and families. She's also worked for Senators Jeff Bingaman and Tom Daschle. So I want to thank you all I know you're all very busy, and I really appreciate your time today. I'll start by asking a few questions. We'll each get a chance to answer, and then we'll turn it over for questions from the audience, and I'm sure we have quite a few questions. So I'm going to start with what I think the issue is on everybody's mind, which is, basically in President Obama's first press conference, right after the midterm elections were announced, he listed education as one of the areas with potential for bipartisanship. So I'm wondering, what are the odds, do you think, that Congress can pass a bipartisan ESEA bill this legislative year, and where do you see potential for agreement or conflict?
Want to start?
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess following up on what Chris said about time to take a look back and look forward, I'd just start by saying that, well, first of all, thanks to all of this organizers for putting this together. I really appreciate you doing it and keeping education on the top of the agenda for folks. I think the administration is very proud of what we've been able to accomplish over the last 20 months or so in education. I think it's given us a chance to demonstrate that it is a top priority for both the President and the Secretary. I think we feel like we've accomplished a lot through our ARA programs, including Race to the Top, I3, School Turnaround, Teacher Incentive Fund. We're really proud of the work we've done with Congress around college access and completion with the increase in Pell Grants and community college funding stream that we're continuing to work on. So I think there's a real commitment from the administration to keep a focus on education. As the Secretary said a couple months ago, we also are just really inspired by what we see as a quiet revolution going on across the country around education, where you see tremendous state leadership from the NGA and CCSSO around standards, thousands of districts filing applications for things like I3, states, many states changing their laws to be more competitive in terms of Race to the Top. So we see a real commitment and hunger for improving the education system at the state and local level as well. I think the question of whether it will become a priority in the new Congress for the Congress, the jury's out about that, but I would say my money is on that they will move forward. And the reason I think that is, first of all, leadership. There's a tremendous amount of leadership in the Congress around this issue. On the Republican side of the aisle, from Boehner to Senator Enzi and Senator Alexander to Congressman Klein, I think they have a record of commitment to education as well as a record of bipartisanship on this issue. I think that is matched by the tremendous leadership on the Democratic side with Senator Harkin and Congressman Miller, and the support that I know they have from their leadership on the Democratic side of the aisle. I think the President has made it really clear that this is a top agenda item for him. Arne Duncan has made it clear to every person who will listen to him that it is a top priority for him. So I think you have leadership, and then I think the other thing you have is need. There's a big need for us to move forward as quickly as possible. I don't want to bore you with too many statistics, but 36% of schools did not make AYP in the 2008-2009 school year. In 2011-12 school year, we predict it'll be somewhere around 56%. 12-13, it'll be 60%, which I think means the system's going to lose validity if it hasn't already. So we need a system that does have validity for people on the ground. I also think, although there were a lot of really good things about No Child Left Behind, I was part of its development. I was a believer in it. I'm still a believer in it, but I think it's hard to argue that it's not outdated. We need a law that matches what's happening in the real world. And there's dozens of examples I can give you of where the law is now outdated. I think one of the biggest ones is this, because of this tremendous leadership at the state level, not the federal level, around standards, we have a law where there's a mismatch. where there's new standards and we need a new system that is conscious of that. There's also just been developments in the field that were not in existence when No Child Left Behind was created. Biggest example of that is growth. We didn't use growth as the measurement for AYP because nobody could do it. Now people can do it, and we want more people to be able to do it, so the system should adjust to it. I think the third reason the bill should move forward is because America needs it. If we want to ensure our long-term economic prosperity, we need to make education the top agenda item. You know all the statistics about falling from 1st to 11th. And probably the most important reason we need to do it is because kids need it. They can't wait. The kids who are, who are targeted for the president's 2020 goal, they're in school right now, and if we don't try to get them the supports that they need to be successful, then we're not going to meet that goal. And I guess the last thing I would say is, I know it's a very partisan environment right now, but I don't think, just based on my experience in Capitol Hill, this isn't really as hard a set of issues as you see in a lot of other contexts. I mean, I think that there's bipartisan agreement, maybe not consensus, but there's bipartisan agreement about the top line things that we need to accomplish. Devil's always in the details, but there's controversy over our turnaround models, but there isn't controversy over the fact that we need aggressive interventions in the schools that are at the bottom 5% of performance and have made no progress over 3 years. I haven't heard anybody argue that we should leave those schools alone. There's disagreement over how to construct teacher evaluation systems, but there's growing consensus that, first of all, that we need new evaluation systems and that we should be looking at outcomes in that context. So just having worked on this issue for the last 10 years, it just seems like there's just more and more agreement around the substance. So if it doesn't happen, it just seems to me that it's because people decide they don't want anything to happen. And if that happens, I think it would just be a real shame.
Yeah. I'm going to let Jamie answer now, just because she's got to get going.
Well, I agree with a lot of what Carmel said. I mean, I think, we've seen already some great leadership from Mr. Klein in his statements coming on the heels of the election about his commitment to moving a bill and to some of the big picture issues like the importance of that education, the role of education in our economy and those sorts of issues. So I think it won't be because of the topic if we don't get it done. It'll be because of the bigger picture politics. I agree with Carmel that the bill is outdated, and we need to be focusing on where our system is now, knowing that our students need college and career ready standards, knowing that we have the data systems to support local flexibility. Those are the things that we didn't have in place in No Child Left Behind. As far as conflict goes, because I know that's what everybody wants to focus on, there actually isn't a lot, and I think it's in the details, not in the big picture, and that means it's doable and overcomable, to make up a word today.
No made-up words.
I know.
No made-up words.
So I think if we need to just start putting one foot in front of the other and getting this done, and the House got very far last year in a very bipartisan manner, and we'll have to see what the Republicans have some work to do early next year, per usual, when we have switch in leadership. But I totally think it's doable.
David, obviously your boss is going to be a linchpin if this is going to be a bipartisan bill. What's your take on the outlook?
Sure, I think I would echo a lot of the things that both Carmel and Jamie have said. There's reason to be cautiously optimistic that we can get it done. There are larger leadership discussions that need to be had that are kind of unrelated to it, but will certainly impact the ability to do an education bill. And I'm not privy to that. But when you look at the blueprint and look at, I call it the topic sentences of the blueprint, there's a lot of things that are pretty attractive to Republicans. Charter schools, paying teachers more for teaching well, state and local flexibility, reducing the federal footprint of the AYP model from No Child Left Behind, consolidation of programs. Those are things that have kind of spoken to Republicans. Senator Alexander clearly is a fan of the Duncan Obama agenda on education. He went to the floor in all my months are mixed up, but I think it was in October after he watched the president give an education speech and just spontaneously ran to the floor to talk about how good the education agenda was and how he really liked the topic sentences of what Obama and Duncan are talking about. So I think at that level there's a lot of opportunity and possibility. Details matter, and we'll spend a lot of time haggling and fighting over those details. And the external leadership issues. Money is also an issue that we'll have to figure out. There's not any new money. There's probably have to be cuts in education, so we'll have to figure all of that out. But I think there's reason for some cautious optimism.
Rick, from an outsider's perspective, do you see cautious optimism?
I mean, it's funny, in D.C. people they're hopeful or optimistic that a bill gets done. I can't imagine why we much care whether a bill gets done. The bills, in my experience, frequently do as much harm as good. So, all of these three guys know infinitely more than I do about what's actually going on and how this is going to unfold. But I'll just share kind of what I see from where I sit. We often talk about the bipartisan tradition in education, but I think what we it's really going to be funny if it's like the CIA. Then it'll be awesome.
Probably left a message.
Yeah, they often do. The CIA.
But when we talk about the bipartisan tradition, what we really usually mean is 1965 to 2001. For the vast majority of the history of the federal role in education, it was really a case of sprinkling money on states and LEAs. And if there's one thing it's pretty easy to get bipartisan accord in Congress on, it's that it's a nice thing to give out money through formulas to your constituents. Since 2001, we've actually entered somewhat of... Well, let's put her on.
Yeah. It was Bethany Little, for those of you who know who that is. The fun irony.
She can answer questions, yeah.
She's probably watching.
Yeah.
I bet.
So since 2001, since No Child Left Behind, since Race to the Top, I think we're seeing education play out differently in terms of the national conversation. Instead of it being a bipartisan touchstone about giving away money, it is now much more deeply intertwined with the larger debates which shaped the 2010 election, for instance, about the role of government, about whether Washington's pushing too far, about whether its footprint has gotten too big. Second, when we think about all of these prior bills, as David alluded to, there's no money this time. All of those prior bills involve substantial new inflows, which are one of the classic ways of keeping the education constituencies placated. Second, I think I'm somebody who's a real fan of what the President and Secretary have done when in messaging on charter schooling, on teacher quality, on teacher pay. At the same time, I think it's important to note that the comity that you see, say, with David Brooks or the Wall Street Journal editorial page is, I would argue, only really skin deep. If you start thinking about a lot of what's unfolded in the last 2 years, whether it's student lending, whether it's the Harkin hearings, whether it's gainful employment regulation, whether it's Duncan's messaging around edu-jobs, that we've already cut through sinew and into bone in districts across the land, and that we have to step up with no conditions attached, I would argue that this has actually created much more friction, much more politicized friction than is often recognized. And third, if we look at the shape particularly of the House, we see 80-plus freshmen coming into the GOP caucus, none of whom I think are coming to Washington to write a new education bill. Even if cognoscenti tell them that this represents a dialing back of Washington, I don't think many of them are going to be excited to run in 2012 saying, I went to Washington and I voted for the big new education bill, unless it is clearly and unmistakably a rollback. At the same time, if you look at the 42 Dems, for instance, who had ADA ratings under 75 in the last Congress, about two-thirds of those folks are no longer going to be in the new Congress. So we're looking at a much more NEA-friendly, much more conventionally liberal Democratic caucus. That suggests to me that especially in the House, the easiest place to find common ground is going to be pretty much on gutting NCLB rather than a nifty rollback of overwrought provisions. I'm not sure if the administration or the key players in the Senate are going to be comfortable with that. Ultimately, what I think is much more likely than reauthorization is something we're hearing is impossible today, but I'm still willing to bet is about 75% likely before the 2012 election, is something that looks like the AMT patch, or the doc fix in Medicare, where Congress says, hey, you know what, we don't want to have half the nation's schools identified as needs improvement or subject to the remedy cascade. So what we're going to do is just render NCLB toothless with AMT-style statutory provision.
Well, Jamie, before you get going, what about that? Do you think that Chairman Miller would support kind of a patch to NCLB or regulatory relief on some of the areas that there's the broadest agreement?
I think it's way too premature to decide that's the road. Right? I think we, you know, as per usual, we sometimes take some years to get a bill done. I think in the Senate we did higher ed 3 times before we actually got it done. And you know, that's at this point part of the process, and these are massive pieces of legislation. I think, you know, in all the work that we did last year, and these are all things that we've said publicly that we were working on, you have to be careful when you do that. There are a lot of things that leverage other things in the bill. So if you look at things that we're supporting that, you know, allow this process to be bipartisan, is something like consolidation. You can't do consolidation if you patch it. But if you really want to talk about resources to districts, not making them apply to 30 programs to get $2 million each, that's a huge cost saver for them. So I think we need to think really big picture about what money means here. And you know, you mentioned all the other range of issues in education that might be causing friction or not causing friction. I think the first thing you learn when you come work in Washington is you have to silo some of your conversations and decide that the K-12 conversation is going to be about the K-12 conversation. It's not going to be about gainful. And I think that's what gets all of our bosses back in the room every time. I mean, my boss is in leadership. You know, Mr. Alexander's in leadership. Arnie Duncan goes in campaigns. It's kind of the way this works. But they figure out what they agree on and figure out if that's enough and move forward on that.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Just say one more thing about what Rick said. I guess that I think I understand what you're saying about looking 65 to current times, but when I'm talking about the history of bipartisanship, I'm talking about in my 12 years working in political and policy circles. So maybe that's wrong of me to do, but I was in the thick of, these guys can tell you, in the thick of every education bill passed in the last 12 years. And, you know, there were a couple in there that were partisan. Usually there was one on student loans.
Bills.
Yeah, reconciliation bills. But even reconciliation bills, like we passed 2 reconciliation bills with bipartisan support. I think that there is, again, people like Senator Alexander and Mike Enzi have worked on a bipartisan basis on even, and Ted Kennedy stepped up and worked on a reconciliation bill on student loans with Mike Enzi when he was not in charge, when he was in the minority. So I think if you just look, because ESEA is not the only education bill, as you're pointing out, but you know, we passed Perkins, we passed IDEA, we passed Head Start. So that bipartisan tradition is there from that 12-year time frame. And some of those people have left, but a lot of the key, I think when you look at those 80 freshmen are not going to write ESEA reauthorization bill. It's just not the way it works. They'll obviously have a huge say in what's in it and what isn't, but there's leadership there, which is what, in my experience, is what gets big pieces of legislation done, or even small pieces of legislation done, is leadership, and we've got really, really strong leadership.
Well, this is, I think, what's going to be interesting about the new Congress. I mean, for instance, NCLB, right, 390 votes in the House, 89 in the Senate, so broad bipartisanship. But by 2004, you saw massive buyer remorse, I would argue, on the GOP side of the aisle. If you actually did a straw poll in 2004, 2005, I suspect you would have not even polled 50% of the Republican caucus in either. I could be wrong.
Well, it could be true with the Democratic caucus as well.
No, absolutely. But so I think, no, that's right. But I think when we talk about when we talk about a bipartisan vision here, on NCLB in particular, when we're talking K-12, I think that was very much a Bush administration phenomenon and not a broad-based bipartisanship. And I think as we look at, these 80-odd new members and kind of the center of gravity, particularly in the Republican side of the aisle, when I hear you talking about things that I certainly find attractive, identifying the worst-performing 5%, supporting, high-quality teacher evaluation and compensation, I support that. I suspect that the vast majority of these 80 new members would probably be notionally supportive of it. I don't think you're going to find any of them wanting to write federal legislation, which is pushing states on it. And so I think it'll be interesting to see where the center of gravity comes out in that caucus.
So
But I think that's the challenge.
Sorry,
for-
go ahead.
For Republicans, as we look at this, we've got. I'm going to assume that when you say 80 odd new members, you meant mathematically, not their personalities. But so we've got this huge new influx of members in the House and new senators coming that are going to engage in this conversation. And a lot of the existing Republicans are re-engaging in this conversation and starting to really think about it for the first time. And you've got Mike Enzi, you've got Lamar Alexander, who spend a lot of time thinking and talking about education policy, but there are lots of senators on both sides that don't. I mean, we've been working on healthcare and financial reg reform and EPA, and there's just all these things that people are thinking about. So as we are talking with Republican members, as my boss talks with his colleagues, as Mr. Klein and Mr. Miller are talking to their new members, the question is not whether or not there's going to be a federal role. I know that there are those that would like to get rid of the Department of Education. Senator Alexander ran on that premise in 1996 on the "I had been there, let's blow it up." His view has changed a little bit, but there is a question of the question that Boehner was asked back in 2001. There's a federal investment. There's a federal resource here. What do we want out of that? What are the things that we ask states and districts to do with that? And there's a lot of push-pull. And the question that I think Obama and Duncan have put forward is, or the option that they put forward is, a pretty significant retrenchment of the federal, the No Child Left Behind AYP. 95% of schools are going to get dinged one way or the other, to almost the mirror of that of 5% or less. And that might be an attractive option. The other thing to think about is there a role for Senator DeMint and Senator Cornyn and Representative Hoekstra's legislation of letting states just opt out and charter out and say, we don't want that. Here's our plan. We'll let you know how things go every year, and we'll tell you in 5 how things went. Or Senator Alexander has a flexibility bill that's kind of in the middle of all of that, where it's a more interactive with the Secretary of trying to figure out what do we hold states accountable for. So there's ways that we can work all of that, and there's a legitimate question for a lot of members: do we even have a federal role? Sure. Then there's members kind of all over the place of big, heavy, massive federal involvement, national standards, national assessments, national curriculum, to nothing. So there's a lot of push-pull in that, but our job as staff and as members is to figure out what to do. And I think that we have that opportunity to at least have those conversations.
I was just going to say, I think one question frankly, the Republicans are going to have to ask themselves, particularly on our side, is what do they want to deliver, right? And what can they deliver? And it still is. It's a divided Congress. They're going to have to figure out divided Congress, meaning Senate controlled by the Democrats. They're going to figure out what Obama will sign, and just continuing to push forward stuff that isn't going anywhere isn't a lot to bring home in 2012 either. So, and this to me seems like one of the things that we could actually do.
Okay, I'm going to turn it over now for questions from the audience. I'm sure we have a lot. Fritz, you want to start us out?
These are questions.
Fritz Edelstein, Public-Private Action. Everyone agreed that the bill is outdated. And obviously, the original bill passed in 1965. Things have changed significantly. All right, okay. How do we then write a piece of legislation that doesn't get outdated again in 4 years, and we have the scramble? No, there are things. How do you write a bill that includes things that plans for the future rather than is structured in such a way that it doesn't take into account what growth or change can happen?
From my perspective, I don't think you can. You write a law for the time that you're in, and you try and do a little bit of planning for what it is that you think that you're going to see. But you look at, I've been around for a while, feeling old today because I've got a cold. But we did IDEA in 2004. We made some changes, and then you watch, and the job of staff and members is to watch the implementation of it. And then in 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 years, depending on higher ed, you then make changes and update. I don't think that there's any scenario where you can say, here's the law for the next 40 years. That's just not how we function.
Yeah, I'm going to, can I answer
Oh,
that?
yeah,
Run?
please,
I
please,
apologize.
please.
I agree, David. You do the
Yeah.
best that you possibly can, but I do think, we figured out the things that we got right and No Child Left Behind, and the things we didn't get right. And I think, where we do consider places that we want to be more flexible than we were under current law are the places that allow things to be outdated less fast, if you will. Because there are places where we can let states and districts make some more decisions than we have under current law. But then there are things like data systems. I don't think we can predict that we're going to know, we would have known that much change was going to happen in data systems over the last 8 years.
Who heard of a cloud in 2001? Who heard of the cloud in 2001?
Right, we just didn't know. And so that's why we try and reauthorize laws as fast as we possibly can. I apologize.
Oh, thanks for coming. Yeah.
I think I think it also speaks to the need for humility in legislation. The idea of a few targeted things, charter schools, teacher pay, things like that, where we have a little bit of a better sense, and then trying to not build a better mousetrap and try and catch every hook, but trying to kind of build a better framework of how states and locals can implement the law, because they're the ones that have to really do the brass tacks.
I guess I would just say, Fritz, to that question that I think Jamie and David are right. It's probably inevitable that the next iteration will become outdated, but I think we feel like the proposal that we've put forth does envision a very different federal role than the one we currently have, and part of the difference is in giving greater state and local flexibility and sort of defining where we want you to go, definitely setting a framework that we think is necessary for success around things like having a strong teacher evaluation system, having a data system in place that gets you the information that you need to be successful, having college and career ready standards. So if you look at our proposal, we're trying to put in place some building blocks for reforms to happen, but then saying to states and districts, but we're not going to tell you exactly how to spend this money or how you're going to get there, but we want to show results in exchange for the federal funds. So I think our consolidation strategy, our change in the accountability system are all changes that will make it less likely that the law will become outdated, because it allows for a much, much higher degree of state and local flexibility than current law does.
Okay, let's get another question. Noelle?
Good afternoon. I'm Noelle Ellerson with the American Association of School Administrators. And I'm hearing a lot at this panel and other ones over the past couple of weeks about looking at what it's going to take to reauthorize the new law, but looking more immediately for my members. And there's a lot of pressures and things that have been building up, and we've all agreed that the law is outdated. So in bridging the gap between where we are now with some implementation issues and a bill when it does finally come to fruition, how would you gauge a palette for regulatory relief on some items that we anticipate being addressed in the final bill when it comes, whenever that is?
So I think if we can move in early in the new year, that we can have a new bill and a new construct very quickly, and I'm hopeful that that's going to happen. AASA and other groups have come to us with requests for waivers under current law. That's something we're taking a look at. I mean, I think that the challenge there is I don't think it's acceptable to either the president or the secretary that we would sort of freeze things in time and just essentially have no accountability in the interim. So we really want to have a new system of accountability that we are able to move forward in legislation and really focused on doing that.
David?
I think there are some legitimate issues and concerns that you raise, but the challenge is, depending on what you do, what does that do to the ability of Congress to continue to move forward? If you take away, if you do things, if the administration were to start doing things through regulatory steps, in that balance, assuming that we're doing a comprehensive bill, which Senator Harkin and at least Mr. Miller have said that that's what their plans are, as soon as you start pulling apart the things, the fixes, the changes, it makes it that much more difficult for Congress to actually reach some of the negotiated settlements. I mean, you're never going to get a point where Senator Harkin and Senator Enzi are going to 100% agree on every aspect of everything. You know, Senator Harkin gets this, Senator Enzi gets that, Senator Alexander gets this, Senator Dodd gets that. I mean, that's probably not appropriate for me to point it out, but that's the way that it works, but that's kind of the way that it works. Everybody understands that. And so you just have to be careful what it is that you provide relief from. And then depending on how much relief you provide, does that then build from kind of the outside the pressure to say to Congress, don't do nothing. You all stay out of it. We got Arnie. He's going to help us. He's our hero. So you have to be very careful what you ask for.
Okay. What about a more targeted bill, though? Like one that just deals with certain areas?
Well, I work for Senator Alexander, and he has suggested the thought that Congress doesn't do comprehensive well. So I think that it is in his thought process of trying to figure out what are the most significant fixes that need to be done, do them quickly as we continue the comprehensive conversation. But I watched a panel yesterday where Senator Enzi's staff expressed some concern about that. Mm-hmm. Senator Harkin has rejected that. Mr. Miller has rejected that. I don't know that means that Senator Alexander's not going to stop pressing that issue. He's thinking through all of these things over this fall or whatever season we're in. Mm-hmm. But traditionally ESEA is done as one big bill.
Right.
So I don't know, but I would never count my boss out.
I think I hit the front row. Go ahead. No? Yes, next question. Sorry.
Thanks. My name is Anya. I'm I work here at Pew Center in the States. So welcome everybody to our beautiful conference space. And my question is, what I'm not hearing at all in this panel is something that is bipartisan, and that's a focus on research and research-based and research-proven. That's something that's a big focus of ours at Pew. Getting into issues when there is a research-based way forward. So in the 2001 iteration of ESEA, there are some aspects of that, doing research-based interventions and things like that. So where do you see the role of research in this reauthorization? And also, what do you think the role is going to be for some very research-proven strategies such as early childhood education?
Carmel, you want to start us off? Sorry.
Sure. So I think the administration has demonstrated its commitment to building an evidentiary base in education and trying to drive the concept of evidence-based decision-making at the state and local level. So that's something we're really committed to. I3 is sort of our signature program in that regard, but we're pursuing it in other contexts as well. The fine line there is you want things to be evidence-based, but I think maybe what happened in recent history around that is that shouldn't translate to the federal government dictating the strategies in a very detailed way on the ground level. So I think that it's something that we want to see move forward. I think we feel like there isn't enough of an evidentiary base in this field as it is. We've proposed increased funding for research and evaluation on the teacher front. We're being very aggressive about looking at our existing investments in that space and figuring out whether we can improve implementation, whether we need to think about changing the programs like looking at comprehensive centers, labs, TA centers, and saying how can we make sure that we're really getting bang for our buck in that context. Obviously, the administration strongly supports early learning. I think we have a really impressive track record on that front. We had significant increases in Head Start and child care, new program for home visitation that passed as part of the health care bill, and have proposed a Race to the Top-like program for the early learning space through the Early Learning Challenge Fund, and we're hopeful that Congress will actually fund that program.
I think there continues to be strong bipartisan support for a strong research base. I think what we did in the 2002 reauthorization of the Education Science Reform Act was a necessary, I call it that Russ Whitehurst threw chlorine tablets into the research pool and got rid of all of the bad stuff that was out there. And sure, he went to the gold standard modality only, but it was necessary to kind of kill off all of the bacteria that was out there. And now John Easton has come in, and I don't want to say that he's relaxed it, but he's kind of broadening the scope a little bit to include more than just the gold standard research, and I think that's appropriate and that's fine. I think as we look at state and local flexibility, the question to states is when you're going to do things, demonstrate to the public, not necessarily to us or to Secretary Duncan, because he's not going to sit and read any of these boxes of forms that come in, but demonstrate to the public, demonstrate to the to the education community in your state that you're pursuing a research-based activity, that the things that you're trying to do have some foundation in some quality level of research. I'll stop there.
Okay, Rick?
Yeah, I mean, I think the notion of trying to drive policy with research is one that's fraught. I mean, the most famous example that comes to mind for me of Congress trying to do this is Reading First, where it turned, which I think conceptually was a terrific idea. Turns out, though, that figuring out what counts as good research and using it to actually drive the expenditure of dollars in a systematic way, turns out there's a whole lot of what we call implementation, which is actually design and program element questions, which pretty much blew up. I'd argue that I3, particularly I think if hearings are held, is going to, we are going to be increasingly squeamish about. For instance, KIP got the $50 million for scale up, and Lord knows I love KIP, but all of KIP submitted research actually dealt with the efficacy of the KIP model, whereas the $50 million was for leadership preparation. At the same time, NIMSY was ruled, that the evidence for NIMSY was ruled irrelevant. I'm still not quite sure how this played out. And then if we start looking at some of the adjustments made around I3 scoring, I think the notions of what constitutes evidence and what it involves when we have folks either at the U.S. Department of Ed or agents of the U.S. Department of Ed trying to judge this, we oftentimes find ourselves in substantial difficulties. This is not all that different from, say, healthcare. When we look at NIH-funded research, there's stuff that tends to play best at the basic science. The stuff that tends to be messier, the people who complain the most are the people involved in public health. When you get into needle distribution, when you get into fighting childhood obesity, this is where you get huge concerns in the public health community that they're not being given their fair share, that their research isn't being treated with the respect that it deserves. That's because these questions are much less about simple applications of science and much more about using science to come up with complex policy solutions. So, and frankly, I mean, I think it's perfectly legitimate for Carmel to say, hey, it's a good thing we put money into pre-K, early childhood, but I'm somebody who thinks the research on the whole on pre-K and early childhood shows little, if any, confidence that this is money well spent. Perry Preschool is not the modal program, as best I can tell. And so I think we've spent billions and billions over the years, and I'm not at all confident that we actually got our money back in terms of value delivered. So, I'm a big fan of research. I think it's real. I think there's real complex questions of trying to use research to drive policy.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Back, right there.
Teddy Downey. I don't know, Teddy Downey from MF Global. I was wondering if you could talk about higher education policy for a second. What's going to happen with Pell Grants, student loan rates, for-profit colleges, congressionally and maybe on the regulatory side as well?
So we are in the middle of the regulatory process with respect to some provisions that were included in the higher education reauthorization bill, that a set of program integrity provisions that include, we still haven't completed the process with respect to one set of regulations around something called gainful employment. That's something that the Secretary wants to take some time to make sure that we get right. Our objective is to make sure that we tackle bad actors in that space without hampering good actors, because I think he believes they play a really important role in terms of our college completion goals and helping students to be successful. We are very, very focused on making sure that we're implementing the student loan programs in a way that ensures that students are getting the money they need to go to college. We've been pretty pleased with the conversion from FEL to DL. We have not experienced big problems at the institutional level with that conversion, and we just want to make sure that we're working with the servicers, who are private entities, to make sure that students are getting the services they need once they have the loans and start paying them back. Big focus for us in terms of post-secondary is going to be how can we make sure we've got lots of investments that are designed to help kids go to college and complete, and are we doing everything we can in those programs to make sure that those dollars are effectively spent. We're about to have, we have an upcoming Gear Up competition, and we want to make sure that that's a good competition and those funds are used to help tackle the college completion goal. Also working very closely with the Department of Labor on the community college funding that was part of the healthcare reauthorization, the healthcare bill as well as part of SAFRA. There's $2 billion at Department of Labor to provide, to build programs that help unemployed folks get jobs that will help secure their future. So we're very focused on that as well.
I have no comment.
Rick? You get the last word.
Oh, jeez. I mean, I think, you know, I think the Pell Grants, we'll see. That'll be a dollars question. For me, I think the most interesting stuff is the hearings that Harkin has been holding on the for-profits and the gainful employment regulation. And this goes back to, I think it was Fritz's question about unintended consequences of statutes and how do you deal with them. To my mind, I mean, I think Carmel's right. I would absolutely not argue for a second that there's bad apples and sleazy operators in the proprietary space. Absolutely. But that said, my reaction to this stuff is the same way it is to much of the mortgage lending debacle. That, as best I can tell, for 20 years, we've been subsidizing and encouraging the bad apples because we have chosen to make it federal policy that we want to subsidize loans and provide grants for people to get into colleges. Now, it's interesting that public access institutions have generally done a crappy job of sopping up that demand. If you show up at community colleges and you want to take a course and it doesn't fit with their offerings, they say, hey, come back and see us in January and we'll hope to take you in. Not surprisingly, for-profits, precisely because they're money hungry and out there to kind of, you know, soak up the demand they can, have been much more aggressive about creating offerings on a rolling basis, about soaking up students. Now, it's entirely true that federal policy has been paying people to take bodies. We've had little or no consequence attached for doing a lousy job of educating those bodies or for actually rewarding good actors for making sure that people are getting a degree. If we want these institutions to actually do some due diligence on the front end, to make sure they're only accepting people who are likely to benefit from their degree, who are only likely to complete, that's totally cool. But let's be honest about it, and let's write rules that are consistent with that. And what I worry we're doing right now is we're doing gainful employment at the Harkin hearings. When we've paid people to do one thing, we realize that we paid them to do a stupid thing, and now rather than take responsibility, we're sitting here and trying to we're trying to allow, you know, this game of whack-a-mole to substitute for us kind of facing up to our own shortcomings. More broadly, I mean, I think this is the caution about when we look particularly at reauth of the SCA, for instance. One problem with NCLB is it emphasized grade level configurations. So even as we're talking about ELT right now and about getting more creative about grouping students, you're now at odds with your very own state's accountability system. And I worry, for instance, that our best and most cutting edge work on teacher evaluation is entirely built around the premise of a teacher in a classroom with 24 kids for 180 days. And what I would hate us to do is, as we're trying to figure out smart ways to use virtual learning, to control costs, to think more creatively about staffing, to deal in citizen schools, that just at that moment we're reauthorizing a bill which is actually going to make it more difficult in terms of regulation and compliance for districts to use teaching talent smart.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much for joining us today. This has been a great discussion. I'm sorry that we didn't get to all the questions. Thank you. Thank you so much.